feed me. First, caregivers are soul givers, then soul givers, individuating us. To be not our souls, but soulless systems solely operating and doing their business until we break the spell and cease to slave unknowingly. Still the prison. Walk out into the sun and serve God. So about 8 years ago or so, I did a demonstration and I called it Rubber Duckie. And it was on Yoga Sutra 1.32. And it's using Vyasa's commentary, and I used the book translation by Hariharananda. Today, I wanted to do it again, only I wanted it to be a little different. I want it not to be, it's already on somewhere, so I don't want it set. I want us to engage with this sutra. So first, the surrounding. Yoga Sutra 130. Sickness, dullness, doubt, carelessness, laziness, cravings, delusion, failure to reach a yogic stage, and instability to sustain a yogic state. These 9 and anything else that causes agitation are obstacles to yoga. They also lead to frustration, which is a vibration on top of a vibration. Agitation over a failure to still consciousness. Now that's my commentary. That's my translation. Translation is again mine. 131. Mental pain, depression, anxiety, restlessness, nervousness, and hard breathing. If we are experiencing these symptoms, then we have already allowed obstacles to get in the way of our practice. The symptoms do not cause the distractedness, they express it. (132) Constant awareness of one abiding truth or principle. When we focus in this way, we quiet the chatter and the vibrations. So, this is Hariharananda's translation of 132. For their stoppage of distractions. Not the symptoms. If you stop the distractions, the symptoms go away. So for the stoppage of the distractions, practice of concentration on a single principle should be made. Now, how many people tend to think that if I just think a thought, then I am concentrating? When we say concentration, when we say focus, it is a deeper level. Very important. Now, Vyasa, I forget when he wrote. When did he write? I don't know.
It was a few centuries later, I think. It's going to be around, I want to say 6th or 7th century.
That's where I was. 6th or 7th century. Don't quote me. And he was speaking to other people or other systems. And that's what this commentary, he's refuting other commentaries. So, here we go. For the elimination of distractions, the mind should be fixed on one principle for purposes of practice. So, Hariharananda says, for practice of one principle, Ishvara, God, and I sense are best. I am the observer of all the modifications that are taking place every moment in the mind. A recollection of such an I as a support of contemplation is very soothing to the mind. This is what the Upanishads call contemplation on I sense. And Vyasa then says, for those who hold the mind, that the mind is nothing but one state, limited to one object, and is without a substrate, only a momentary impression, and thus transitory, the mind will always be one-pointed. For then there cannot be a distracted or disturbed mind. So, Hariharananda then says, it is laid down that a disturbed mind should be made one-pointed. The commentator here counters the opinion of those who hold that the mind is a momentary thing. And this is where we're going. So a momentary thing is, can you see this? Okay. One thing. One thing. That's it. The mind is without a substrate and is limited. It's momentary, limited to one thing. So when people say they are great multitaskers, they are saying that they are doing things at the same time. But they're not. They are doing one thing, and then one thing, and then one thing. It's always different. They are not doing. So it would make sense to think that the mind is nothing but one state limited to one object and is without a substrate, only a momentary impression and thus transitory. If it's only one object and it's transitory, it cannot ever be distracted. So for people who look outside, have no reflection, they're just staring out there, they only have one object at any given moment. There is no substrate, and they are in fact dependent on the external world to actually keep them in any kind of semblance of order and in check in any way. And everything is about that outside. Never about them, because they only have one thought, and it's all transitory. So, such people think that the mind comes into existence with a thought and disappears with it, and that it is only a state or a modification without any substratum and is wholly transitory. Can everybody see this? And there are a lot of people who actually operate this way. So it makes a lot of sense. One thought. I can even have one thought. And I'm always never distracted. I think, which is the joke. But the mind becomes one-pointed. This is back to Vyasa. One-pointed only when it is withdrawn from various objects and set on only one object. For this reason, it is to be held that it is not occupied by one object only. Yes?
So someone is so lost in something that they're like a big bang and they don't even lose focus on it. That's actually a distracted mind.
Think of a deer in the headlights. Totally. Yeah, go ahead.
So any loss of subject and object is actually a distracted mind.
Correct.
Even if that seems like, even though a lot of people would call that person very focused because they're so focused on what they're doing that they don't notice anything else going on around them. From the commentary, that's still a distracted mind because they're lost in the...
Yes.
There's no substrate.
There's no substrate. They are just lost in... That's why it's called asmita and is an actual affliction. So the truth is, it causes terrible agitation ultimately.
Right, because the person has no control over it.
The person what?
The person has no control over it.
Correct. There is no... That's right.
They are subject to this intense concentration, being lost in the activity.
They're at the mercy of this outside
right
thing.
Whether it's one or many.
Correct. And if it is many, it's only many at one time only.
Right. It's flitting from one to another.
Correct. 100%. Does that make sense to everybody?
So regardless of whether whether someone is concentrated on something for one thing for a long period of time and lost in it, or flitting between lots of different things one after another, both of those are still distracting.
Correct.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. I'm muted. I'm not sure I understand exactly what does then trigger the change from the attention on one object and the next. Because if you cannot be disconnected from what you're being attentive to or withdrawn in something
It just shows
specific.
up. It just shows up. So it's very much at the mercy of the outside. And it's a good question, because in this situation, that's not answered, is it? Where the one thought in the mind actually shows up. It's not answered. So, that's why, but the mind becomes one-pointed only when it is withdrawn from various objects and set on only one object. So it has to be, we have to be willing to reflect. There has to be some activity going on that we consciously do. And who and what that is, a lot of people have no idea, and they don't want to know. For this reason, it is to be held that the mind is not occupied with only one object. So, again, in the commentary by Hariharananda, if the mind is transitory, therefore, there cannot be any justification for calling a mind disturbed, one-pointed, etc., because each mind is, on this view, separate and short-lived. And each must therefore be one-pointed, as each mind has only one object to think upon. It's only one. So, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, here. No different. Here. This is reality. This is reality. This is reality. Always. It's transitory. There's no conflict. Apparent conflict. Again, this is Vyasa. Those who hold that the mind becomes one-pointed through the continuous flow of separate but similar ideas would have to say that one-pointedness is a character of the flow of ideas. Correct? It's a flow of the same ideas. So here we are again, we're dealing with similar. So we have to have only, we can have him, a flow of similar ideas. Does everyone see that? But this also cannot be true, because in their own view, the mind itself is momentary. And how, in that case, can there be a flow of one mind You can't. This is a flow of similar ideas. I don't know about you, but can one momentary mind actually flow? It can't. If, on the other hand, it is held that one pointedness is the characteristic of each component of a continuous flow of ideas, flow whether of similar ideas or dissimilar ideas, then each component idea will be individually one-pointed. So to that, even if you have dissimilar ideas, a flow of dissimilar ideas, which you'd have to have either similar or dissimilar, then is this one pointed, and then this one's one pointed, and then this one's one pointed, and then this one's one pointed, and it's a flow of endless one-pointed dots? If that happens, there will be no such thing as a distracted mind again. Hence, the mind has to be regarded as one, as being occupied with many objects, and as being a substrate of all modifications. So, how many people think these ideas, or rubber duckies, or whatever you want to call it, are the mind? Yep. But it can't be. And if it was in fact the mind, then somehow this would make sense. But it doesn't. This is not the mind. These are not the mind. They are objects that come out of the mind. The mind would be, as in this container, the water. And within the substrate, the rubber duckies are modifications. Hence, one second, the yoga is the stilling of all the modifications of the mind. These guys, go ahead.
I have a question about one-pointedness. So one-pointedness, there's an idea of direction. So it comes from the substrate or from deeper within, either on the substrate or on the modifications. But I'm not sure I understand where it is pointed at. Is it pointed at the modification, and that's what is understood as the flow of going from one to one?
At this point in this, the way people see this is mainly, so you know, it was a Buddhist, refuting Buddhist ideas of no mind and all that kind of stuff. So you're seeing, based on their idea, there is no substrate. So it's just a momentary creation, object. So it's either, it wouldn't even be created in the mind, it would be the mind. So the idea, where it came from, and where it is, so there's a constant reaction between the external world and the misunderstanding that the external world is creating whatever these things are. So if I'm in a particular quiet place externally, then I'm not going to be bothered by any of these things. But I'm going nowhere. I'm still only looking outside. I'm not going to get it. And for all of us who have now spent almost a year in isolation, really quiet? Really quiet? I don't think so. And I lived in the jungle for a long time, and I watched people, there's really nothing, creating havoc because their minds could not handle it. But we're not there yet because it's, again, what is the mind? We're only beginning. The mind is actually the substrate, not the modifications, not the ducks. Yoga is the stilling of the modifications of the mind, of chitta, of the substrate. It never, if we identify with our modifications, we will never want to attain yoga. And how sad to look at that our modifications, if we just change our modifications, we're done. We're realized. I have the modification, I am realized. That can be any kind of rubber duck. Here, we'll make it into a blue rubber duck. Now I'm done because I have that modification in my mind. However, yoga is the stilling, the dissolving of all modifications in the chitta, in the substrate. So, hence, the mind has to be regarded as one, as being occupied with many objects, and as being a substrate of all modifications. So all modifications, including I am realized, are what?
Just an object, is a thought.
It's just an object. The modification, I am realized, are three objects. As an idea, it's one object, and there's no substrate. It's just a modification. And if I think that, clearly I have not done the stilling of all the modifications. Further, if ideas which are unrelated, distinct, and totally different are born without a common substrate, then how can one idea remember something cognized by another? Very important point. So somebody says something over here, and now they have a new situation that relates to that, and it's completely different. Yes?
This is the problem with the idea nowadays of the confusion of information, knowledge, and wisdom, and that, well, with Google, I can always just look up the answer, so why do I need to know anything? Because if you don't actually have, then that's like there being all these points of information, but no substrate. So there's no way to create a connection between two pieces of information if you have none of them in your own knowledge. And so there's no way to make connections or to solve problems because everything is, there's no substrate.
There's no substrate. They're hanging out here. And you're absolutely correct. And one of the issues is I can't now learn from a situation that happened before because there's no connection. It's just an event. And I just want to get rid of, if I'm obsessed by that event, let's say this event, I'm just trying to get rid of it. So I can't move on to a different event because I'm just totally lost in this one. I'm not learning because I could have learned from something even further back. But we don't do that. We don't even remember it. We're trying not to remember. We think it's good not to remember. We think it's good to have new. So there's no substrate. So there is no learning, no need to learn. Hariharananda then says, if the thoughts are separate and unconnected, the rememberer or cognizer of one knowledge or action cannot be the same as another. And that's for how many people have we watched that contradict themselves all the time and feel that there's no problem in their contradiction. And are angry at anybody who remembers, but you said this over here. You said 2 weeks ago that. How dare you? If it is urged that the latent impression of knowledge or action is retained and reappears in a subsequent thought, then its existence in some form would be postulated, which would be contrary to the basic proposition that mind comes into existence with a thought and disappears with it. So it's back to here, there's a substrate. And so I had this thought, and this actually, now I have this thought, and this thought has some pieces from this other one. because these are just objects, modifications in the substrate, from the substrate. So the modifications, the substrate connects everything. Hence the need to be reflective. Consequently, the Sankhya view that knowledge is but the different states of the same basic entity, the mind, appears to be correct. So, this rubber ducky is an expression of the substrate. This rubber ducky is an expression of the substrate. This rubber ducky is an expression of the substrate. Now Vyasa says, also, how can the state which holds within it the impressions of past actions be different from the state which enjoys the fruits of action? Howsoever the matter might be explained, it would be no better than an example of the logic of equating cow milk with cow dung. And it is fallacious to hold, this is Hariharananda, that cow dung and milk pudding are the same, because both of them come from the same source, the cow. So it goes to this: all that is produced from the cow is milk. Cow dung cakes are produced from the cow. Therefore, cow dung cakes are milk. Both dung and milk are modifications of the cow. Same source, completely different kinds of modifications. And if you can't discern between those two modifications, we have a problem. If we have no reflection, and so no substrate, then you can say anything in the moment, and that everything comes from the cow is milk, you would absolutely believe. Which very quickly somebody would open their mouths, hopefully. Moreover, if each idea of the mind is considered to be uniquely different from every other idea, then that would mean the repudiation of the feeling of one's own self. And Hariharananda says there is yet another argument in support of this view. The eye that saw is the eye that is touching, or the eye that touched is the eye that is seeing. This sort of identifying perception reveals the identity of the knower. I in all the experiences. Do you actually think when you use the word I, you've got different identification? That's scary. then you don't have to answer to anything you did previously. There is no cause and effect, and becomes very dangerous. And Vyasa says, how that would happen is being explained in cognitions like the following. The eye that saw is the eye that is touching, or the eye that touched is the eye that is seeing, although the sensations of touch and sight are different. The feeling of the eye persists in an identical form. How can this sense of personal identity have any identity with the differing sensations of touch and sight? This same sense of ego is experienced by one through one's own feelings. The superiority of direct perception cannot be impugned by any other proof. The other proofs gain acceptance only when supported by perception. Therefore, the mind is one, the water. Takes in many objects, the rubber duckies, and is stable, constant, is not a void, baseless, but a continuous entity. It is this substrate that allows us to actually, truly arise. And if we look at this, the understanding of be with your experience, whatever it is, let whatever comes up from that experience come up. And then from there, function appropriately on the physical plane. You get to see. In order to be with your experience, whatever it is, you have to acknowledge that substrate. You have to be willing to go back and reflect to the substrate, not the rubber duckies. So, they're melting, but these are actually little ducks. And if we put them, and then I'm going to just throw them in. They are, the substrate is the mind. The pieces of ice are modifications. What is going to happen to those modifications? Go ahead, Elizabeth.
They'll dissolve.
They'll dissolve and return back to what?
The substrate.
Correct.
So it's like when you're with your experience, the thought forms disappear because you have to get, I find I have to get behind the thought forms to get to my experience. And then when I'm there, they...
Right. If you do not have the vibration, if you still the modifications completely in the substrate, all of them in the substrate, are you going to have the modification based on the 5 different modifications in the mind. In other words, direct perception, wrong knowledge, right knowledge, fancy.
Well,
Are you going to have any of those?
no, not if they've dissolved.
Not if they're dissolved. What is yoga?
The stilling of all the modifications.
Correct. And then what arises? What then exists?
Who you really are.
Yes, your true nature then really exists. So without the dissolving and the stilling of the modifications, are you going to get to who you truly are?
No, never.
Never. Hence the system. And that's why many people call the Yoga Sutras the psychology, spiritual psychology. Because you're actually using the mind and understanding the mind in a way that so many people don't even begin. Yes.
One thing, I'm watching this thinking, okay, if I'm watching this, how could I misunderstand it? Right?
Right.
And one way people could misunderstand this is because mind is a tricky word in
Correct.
translation of like chitta and
Correct.
stuff, is if I wanted to, if I were totally committed to it, I could take this entire exposition and see it as justifying my identification with my intellect.
But your intellect is made up of what? The intellect. You mean the intellect independent of any modifications?
Right. I'm going to decide that my intellect is the substrate.
Okay.
So, I get it. And then, you see how
Yes.
so someone could look at that and decide, the substrate, when she says mind, okay, my intellect, I'm really my intellect.
Okay.
Right? And that's not at all what you're saying.
Correct. The
But
intellect
someone could
is
decide that because
right. The intellect is part of the faculty of it is the faculty of knowing. It is the two-sided mirror. It is not. You still have objects going in. You still have it is used.
it's still an object itself.
Self.
So what it is like a big rubber ducky.
Correct.
That then you're identified with that, and all the other rubber duckies are seen in relation to that rubber ducky, and you think that rubber ducky is your substrate.
Which is what the problem is. The person who says I, that is thinking, and I, they're identified until they have actually stilled all the vibrations. Their identity is only the reflection in the mirror, which is the faculty of knowing, which is then the intellect. Correct. A lot of you just went, oh, so I haven't had an experience of who I truly am. I just have had an experience. That's why the meditation on the I sense at the beginning. What's the focus? Remember, what's the one principle? And that Hariharananda was saying, and that in the Yoga Sutras, suggestion of that one principle is Ishvara or I sense. I sense is not who we are. Remember, as we go back toward, in terms of samadhi, vitarka, vichara, ananda, asmita, I sense, and that I sense, then that pure I sense has to be let go. It's got to go in order to get to be truly who we are. We're still the dual, we're still the reflection in the mirror when we are pure I sense. Is this becoming clearer?
Can I ask, so is the essence still rubber ducky? That's one of the.
Rubber ducky is a modification, and ultimately the modification of that the object, the reflection, yes, it's still a modification.
And so can I say the substrate is the perceiver?
Is the what?
Perceiver.
The perceiver. Correct. The pure, it's not the perceiver. It is from there that the true perceiver arises. Watch. Yoga Sutra 4:17. The better we know something, the more deeply its vibrations color the mind. Right? So even, so the mind, the more the mind stills, the more everything, the less modifications, the more clear it becomes, the more perfect mirror, the more perfectly it can take in the color of any object. That means it can take in and understand the world better than anybody else. And there's a lot of, oh my goodness, now I understand this. And it also, from the other side, it then can take in who we truly are better. But it is still a reflection. And as a reflection, it is still a modification. Hold on. Here we go. And these are, so you know, my translations of these Yoga Sutras. 4:18, the unchanging self, which is the perceiver with the capital P, is the master of the changing mind and knows all its modifications. So all the light of consciousness comes from the self. The two-sided mirror, the faculty of knowing, that intellect is still the moon. That I sense is still the moon. That pure I sense, still the moon. Now, if we get to that place, wow. It's an amazing place. Yes.
Would you say that the intellect, as that two-sided mirror, sits below the substrate, and then even farther below that is the actual self?
Okay, the pure I sense is below, below, and then it reflects onto the mirror. The intellect is part of the psychic instrument.
So is that part of the substrate, or is it separate?
That's a great question.
That's sort of the thing
question
that I was looking at earlier is how can you have to disentangle the two. It's like there's a sort of individuated kind of
that's part of
shallow
the
substrate.
That's a mechanism. That's an instrument. That would be like saying, is your body part of the substrate? No. Your senses part of the substrate? No.
Right, that's why I was thinking, like, just in continuing the analogy you have in front of you, that if the bottom of the dish were a mirror, you have the water above it. No?
No. The water is going down into the true self, the pure self.
Okay. But I figured that underneath, like at the very bottom, is the true self.
Correct. But if you're going to, the one who recognizes these are only, that's the mechanism of the psychic instrument, which would be the intellect. How pure the intellect is based on how clean all these vehicles are. So the stiller the vehicles are, the more the substrate, the light from the consciousness shines onto that psychic instrument. In other words, again, that pure sense, the self, colors the psychic instrument, which is why a great being knows things that nobody else knows. They're not like everybody else.
So the more dirty we are, the more we are blind to the substrate, and we just, if at all, see the rubber duckies.
I didn't hear.
So if we are really into our intellect, then we are blind to the substrate and are just at all seeing the rubber duckies.
If we're
identified with our intellect, into our intellect,
100%. Yeah, we're blind to our substrate. We're blind to the nature of the mind, the substrate, where the substrate comes from. That there is a substrate, and we are caught up and enamored of our individual modifications. So let me go on. Hold on. 4:19. We know that the mind is not self-illuminating because we can perceive it. It is itself an object and cannot be both a subject and an object simultaneously. Go ahead.
This sort of ties in with that and the other one, and Joe, I assume you would know this, but Augustine in Book 10 of the Confessions goes on his long exploration of memory, which is real kind of similar to what's said about memory, that what Vyasa says, and that the sense of my selfhood, so to speak, as a limited self is about memory, but memory goes beyond that. But at the end of his whole exploration of his memory, the faculty of memory, he says, but in order to know you, God, I will have to go beyond even memory.
Right.
I'll have to let go of memory, which is him saying, I have to let go of the intellect, of any identity that I have constructed through my memory.
Right. Does everyone understand this? And the understanding, the thinking that, the mind is the subject, but is it always? Can you watch your modifications? Where are the modifications occurring? In the mind? Coming out of that substrate? And by the way, we're now really quiet over here. We've resolved back. We've attained the goal of yoga.
Amy?
Yes.
So now those modifications dissolve, but do they come back?
Only if we remember, if we know who we are. A great saint is one whose mind does not think without first giving it permission. So they don't have to come back. I will choose to quietly rest in the heart, connected with God. Now, I have work to do on the physical plane, so I will choose to then do that. But they're not coming out of here anymore if we're really have attained that state. We can always choose to keep stilling and stilling and stilling and stilling. Hence, being with our experience, whatever it is. Let whatever arise. If we're with our experience and we're completely still, nothing will arise. Correct? And then we function appropriately at different times. We don't have to do anything. Or there are things that we do in the world and choose to do in the world, and we choose it. So we use then, as I used to watch Baba, who would be completely still, and watch him enliven each of his vehicles. That light would go through the chitta, the substrate, and enliven the vehicles. That answer? So we can go, I can choose, no, not today. Or, no. Or, yeah, I want to get into it. But am I able to use then and have these rubber duckies be appropriate and useful, or are they just scrambling all over the place? Yeah, D. Yeah. 422. When our consciousness is totally still, which is what we have over here. Consciousness, everything, totally still. We become aware of how we have confused the self with our mechanism of knowing. Then, having achieved chitta, vritti, nirodha, we experience our true nature. The confusion of confusing the mirror, the faculty of knowing, with the self, is what we all do. And there has to be, hence the dark night of the soul is when we are attached to the I sense, looking to God, and God, out of love, drops. Because remember, this is not self-illuminative. God has to hide. We then have to be willing to give up the mirror, which is what Augustine was saying. Same thing. And when we do that, and being upset or angry or hurt is not the dark night of the soul. It is far down the path. So remember, the mind is one. It's a substrate. It has within it many objects. And the truth is, it can be stilled. And it only becomes one-pointed by withdrawing out of the modifications and turning back to one principle. And there are other techniques and tools, but this is the one we're doing. Back to one principle. Hence, the heart, Ishvara, I sense. All right? Clear?
There is one thing that if the mind is an object, it means that it will be a very big rubber ducky that contains all the other small rubber duckies. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can't be. Yes. Yeah, the mind is a substrate. It is not it is not a modification. The rubber duckies are modifications of the substrate. The better quote image was the ice. So out of the water comes the ice, and then back to the water dissolves the ice.
Okay. So the mind is a substrate,
Mm-hmm.
and the self is the substrate of the mind.
No.
It's
Okay. Chitta is the substrate. It is hard to translate mind because as a psychic instrument, mind is so many times translated, it's manas, which is just the data collector. We're not talking about the data collector. The data collector, the intellect, and the ego identifier, ahamkara. Those three, buddhi, are a mechanism that people identify with. But chitta, so it all has to, it is a thing. And within, under that thing, or from that thing, is the substrate.
Yeah, chitta translates
Like
as kind of like the stuff of consciousness.
Stuff of consciousness, yes.
Which is often translated mind.
Right, people
So
translate it as
where
mind.
That's where that opening is to read these translations or hear these explanations and think that your intellect is the substrate.
Right, that's where people get confused. It's not, okay? And this is where if you're working with people who don't understand, they will say, oh, it's just that.
And that's a huge problem in Buddhism too.
It is a huge problem in Buddhism because people will say no mind, which then leaves you open to be able to do anything you want.
You can just be a nihilist.
Yeah, you can do anything. Yes, Clemence.
So, misidentifying the mind with the psychic instrument would be I think, therefore I am. And here what we're talking about is consciousness, but that's completely different yet, still, from
Yes.
who you really are.
Yes. Yes. Correct.
I am, and I can choose to think.
Yes. I used to say it's not I am, I think, therefore I am. It is I am, and therefore I can think. I choose to think. That's where we want to get to. Yes.
When the substrate is still, do we realize that we are not the substrate at that point? Or
you can't have a realization of who you think you are if the substrate's still. In terms of you can't think.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to being and being love.
There's no thought at that point. It just is. It's just,
Right. A thought's a rubber ducky.
right.
It is not. Yes, it's an object.
And it's not just a mind not thinking.
It is, yes. So once we still, then we abide in our true nature. And the way the Yoga Sutras actually are translated correctly, then at all other times we appear to be lost. Because in truth, are we ever truly, who we truly are is never lost. We just apparently play the part and have lost ourselves in the part. Okay. Thank you.